Will Bijan Robinson lead the NFL in rushing this year and in so doing break 2,000 yards from scrimmage?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, welcome back to this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And you know me as Aaron Freeman, your very humble host, also known as Sirius Black, also known as Mr. Drew. My friends call me Negative Nancy, but you can call me Mr. Drew. And of course, today we are talking all about Falcons training camp, although we're not talking all about Falcons training camp on today's episode. We're talking all about Bijan Robinson. In today's episode, talking all about Bijan Robinson is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the NFL. Make over every moment more by visiting FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. And we thank each and every one of you guys that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. Shout out to the everydayers. Make sure you follow in their footsteps by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So as I said, right, another padded practice today for the Falcons. Normally I'd like to do these, camp updates, but nothing really popped off to me that stood out to me that was worthy of a deep dive on today's episode. So we'll get into the topic that I've been teasing throughout the week, which is, talking about Bijan Robinson and his production. And so we'll spend a lot of today's episode talking about Bijan Robinson. Never get tired of that. And, maybe you feel differently. A little bit of today's episode talking about Tyler Allgeier, but this conversation started, last week when I saw NBC Sports / Roto World projecting Bijan Robinson to be the NFL's leading rusher with 1,409 yards this upcoming season. My initial reaction was like, I don't know about that, right? Because I've been on record on this podcast a number of times over the last couple of weeks talking about how I think the fantasy community, which is what, Roto World is part of, is underestimating how much of a share Bijan Robinson and Tyler Allgeier are going to have in the backfield this year. But instead of looking at ways of poking holes in this projection, let's take the opposite angle and look at ways in which this projection may come true, right? It feels like to me, the fantasy community, I think, is basing their projections on Bijan Robinson off of what Derrick Henry did under Arthur Smith in Tennessee rather than what Arthur Smith has done here in Atlanta. And I think that's wrong, but that may be a topic that we can get deeper into on tomorrow's episode. We'll be joined by John Macri of PFF to talk more fantasy projections and whatnot. So we can save that conversation for tomorrow, but let's look at this conversation and let's, look at the ways in which is it possible for Bijan Robinson to put up that type of rushing production this season, without having to get 350 carries or something like that, right? And I think it is, right? I don't think it's out of the norm, out of the realm of possibility based off my own projections for what I think Bijan's going to have this year. I'm projecting him around 200 or so carries, very similar to 210 that Tyler Allgeier had last year. But what's interesting is if you project 250 carries, 1,409 yards on 250 carries would be exactly 5.63 yards per carry, which is the record of a rookie running back set in NFL history for at least a rookie running back that had over 200 carries, set by Adrian Peterson back in 2007. Now, the record, I think, is actually, at least for 150 carries. I don't know what the record is all time, but the record for 150 plus carries is Maurice Jones-Drew, which is 5.66 yards per carry. But let's just say 5.6 is sort of historically good. And Bijan could hit that number and lead the NFL or get to 1,400 yards rushing if he gets 250 carries. Now, again, 250 is a little bit more than I project for him, but not so much more that it's like, that's a crazy projection. And the way that Bijan can hit that 5.6 yards per attempt goes back to the original conversation we had with Charles McDonald back in December when we talked about Bijan Robinson as a possibility. We talked about it in the context of, Tyler Allgeier generates a lot of explosive runs, but, a 20-yard run for Tyler Allgeier is potentially a 30-yard run for Bijan because Bijan has that extra gear, right? A 40-yard run for Allgeier is a 60-yard run for Bijan Robinson. And when you go back and you look at a player like MJD, when you look at a player like Adrian Peterson, one of the reasons why they were so productive, particularly with that yards per carry number, was because they were able to generate those explosive runs. That's a big reason why I don't like yards per carry as a measure of running back efficiency, because it can be so skewed by explosive runs. It's really more a measure of like how explosive a running back is rather than how efficient a running back is on a carry to carry basis. Now, obviously, we're not going to complain about being explosive this year. That's a goal of this Falcons offense. And so if Bijan can get to 5.6 yards per carry because he's more explosive a runner, no one's going to complain about that, regardless of how it affects the efficiency numbers. But once you sort of get that number of like 200 carries to like 250, and then you sort of plug in what like Tyler Allgeier's explosiveness numbers were in a year ago, and then you sort of give it a slight bump to what Bijan, like you don't have to necessarily give it a huge bump. And then all of a sudden, like you can start getting to like 1,400 yards, right? For Bijan Robinson. So it's not as crazy a projection as when I first saw it. I was like, oh, that's no, he's not going to do that. But now it's like, okay, like he could do that if you think he's going to be that level of explosiveness, like Tyler Allgeier plus, and he gets, a bigger work share then. So, just a few more long runs. And if he can generate a few more yards on those long runs, all of a sudden you're talking about it in the realm of possibility. Now, personally, my own projection for Bijan Robinson is more likely, because again, projecting him to be more closer to that 200 carry range, is you're talking more like 1,000 to 1,200 yards for Bijan this year. I feel very comfortable projecting somewhere in that range for Bijan as a rookie rather than the 1,400 plus. But it's not as crazy to think, okay, maybe if I'm wrong on a couple of those projections, and maybe Bijan's a little bit better than even I think he's going to be, he could get to that level of 1,300, 1,400 or so yards. But that may be something that we can take a deeper look in on tomorrow's episode with John Macri of PFF. We'll continue today's episode talking more about Bijan Robinson and the value that he can have as a pass catcher to help offset whatever differences in terms of his rushing success that he may or may not have this upcoming season. And we will get into all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But first, guys, I want to tell you to take your first swing at betting on Major League Baseball over at FanDuel, and you'll get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That means that if you bet $20, you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 that you can spend betting the money line, the over-unders, who's going to hit that first home run. It's all on an app that's safe, secure, super easy to use. Plus, the great thing about FanDuel is when you win, you get paid instantly. And whether you want to bet on Major League Baseball, FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. So you can bet on Bijan Robinson being Offensive Rookie of the Year and hitting some of these, projections that we're talking about on today's episode. You can bet on that as well. So head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up today, and you'll get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel is an official partner of Major League Baseball. So continuing today's episode talking about Bijan Robinson as a pass catcher, we of course already know that Bijan is a very good skill set as a receiving option in the offense. We know that Arthur Smith knows how to integrate a running back into the pass game, as we saw with Cordarrelle Patterson in 2021, but we don't know whether Bijan's integration in this offense is going to be dramatically different than what we saw 2 years ago in Cordarrelle Patterson, right? With Arthur Smith's usage of Cordarrelle Patterson, it was a lot of, basic routes, right? It was screens and hitches and fades and whatnot. Are we going to see an entire route tree with Bijan Robinson, or a more expanded route tree with Bijan Robinson? Is he going to run option routes? Is he going to run, slants? Is he going to run like corner routes and all these things that, receivers would run, but aren't necessarily being expected from running backs besides the screens, a hitch here or there, a wheel route or something like that. And it's hard to sort of glean that from, practice clips, especially the one-on-ones. I know, those clips of him beating Troy Anderson in coverage with some of these juke moves and double moves is going viral for the moment on Twitter and elsewhere. But I personally would recommend not putting a whole lot of stock in that. I think those plays do show the athleticism that Bijan Robinson has, but I don't think that's anything that should be surprising to anybody. I think you're not going to see him do a lot of that stuff in the games because route running is about, kind of efficiency with your steps. Passing is about timing and whatnot, and all this sort of extra stuff that Bijan's doing to create that last little bit of separation on that second or third move is probably not going to happen in the regular season all that much because it's going to potentially throw off the timing, and the quarterback's going to be looking at him looking like he's going to break one way. And unless he absolutely 100% knows, okay, Bijan's going to take this, quote unquote false step, in the wrong direction, the speed of the game that's happening when, the quote unquote real bullets are flying, like that false step is going to cause him to throw it outside when Bijan breaks inside. So like that type of stuff, I don't think is going to happen. So, when you're in practice and there's no ticking clock, there's no pass rush, there's no amount of time the ball has to come out, like you can do all that extra stuff. But, when we get to the games, like, I don't know if you're going to be really doing that. And, I promise I won't go on like a too big a rant about, why people should put less stock in the 7-second clips that they see from practices. But, I do have the Iverson, soundbite ready to go. I haven't been able to play it all summer. So let's get it going.
But we talking about practice, man. What are we talking about? Practice?
So, not pouring cold water on that, because Bijan is not going to be this dynamic, unguardable weapon. He very well could be, but I don't think it's going to be because of what he's showing in these one-on-ones, right? I think this is true for not just running backs, but all receivers, that like there's not a direct correlation between some of this stuff that you see in one-on-ones that you're going to see in the regular season in actual games. But, we know that Bijan's potential in this passing game is going to be tremendous this year. I think when it comes to, like, I feel pretty comfortable and confident in terms of projecting what he can do as a runner, but I don't really feel as comfortable and confident when it comes to what he's going to be as a passer, because again, for the unknown questions that we raised just a minute ago, talking about, is he going to be utilized the same way that CP was? Is it going to be different? All those different things, right? I can project, like, I feel comfortable projecting somewhere between like 50, 60, or 70 targets for Bijan this year. So something around, 35 to 60 catches in that sort of range, for him. Probably somewhere in that 50 range is probably more likely. And you saw a similar split between Cordarrelle Patterson and Mike Davis in 2021, right? That year, Patterson had 69 targets. Davis had 58 targets. Now, what Patterson did on his targets and on his catches, he got a lot more yards on his plays than Davis did, right? And that's a lot of that was due to Patterson being used out wide and running more routes downfield and being more of a deep threat in the passing game, as we saw him make a number of big catches in that season. Than Davis, who was just primarily out of the backfield and, getting 5-yard gains and 7-yard gains and those types of things. Like, you look at the numbers, like 85% of the routes that Mike Davis ran in 2021 came when he was lined up in the backfield, while that number was only 40% for Cordarrelle Patterson that year. And I expect a similar dynamic. Again, how exactly close is it to that with Bijan Robinson and Tyler Allgeier this upcoming season, right? Like, I feel like Allgeier is going to be the Davis guy, who's going to be primarily the backfield guy. He's going to be pass protecting, that sort of thing. He proved that last year that he could do that at a high level, and then that allows you to utilize Bijan more as the weapon, as a pure receiver, similar to what Cordarrelle Patterson that we saw that year. It's a similar dynamic. I think I raised it before on the podcast, that you saw with Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram during Kamara's rookie season back in 2017, where Ingram was in the backfield blocking and Kamara was more of a true blue receiver and rarely was in the backfield and in pass protection. So, to me, when it comes to Bijan as a pass catcher, a lot of questions, don't have all the answers, but the main questions I have is like, when it comes to him as a pass catcher, is he going to be like a go-to guy in these sort of critical down situations on 3rd and 4? Is he going to be split out wide in the slot, right? And in those situations, is he going to be the guy that where Desmond Ridder sees, lining up at the line of scrimmage pre-snap and be like, I like this matchup between Bijan in his corner, Bijan in his safety, Bijan in his linebacker, and is he my first progression in the read because of that? And is that something that the Falcons can rely upon, week in and week out, or is that just going to be something that's a rare occurrence, right? Is Arthur Smith going to utilize him in the same ways that he utilized Cordarrelle Patterson, or has he added more wrinkles to how he's going to utilize Bijan compared to what he did with Patterson? Or is he going to not use, because Patterson, had basically a decade's worth of experience playing as a wide receiver, that allowed Arthur Smith to do more things with him than necessarily he's going to do with Bijan, who's basically had, 3 months to work on his receiver skills, even if he is watching all that Devontae Adams film in the meantime. So don't know that question, right? Is it going to be a lot of sort of short stuff where it's just like designed to get the ball into Bijan's hands to let him do work after the catch, right? Let him go out there and be a dude and be that explosive playmaker with the ball in his hands? Or is there going to be a lot more intention with designing plays that are going to be able to feature Bijan's unique skill set? These are the questions I have. I don't think we're going to get definitive answers in training camp or in the preseason at this point in time. And so I think we'll just have to wait until September to get the definitive answers to those questions. But I do think there's a lot of potential there with Bijan. And so when it comes to some of these projections with Bijan, like, I feel like people can be a lot more optimistic when it comes to, projecting what he can do in the passing game, because it's just a lot more unknown there. So we'll see how that goes, but we'll probably, again, break that down with John Macri of PFF on tomorrow's episode, and make sure you tune in and continue to make us your first listen. So shout out to the everydayers that will do so. And of course, you can follow us on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, but we'll continue talking Bijan as well as Tyler Allgeier to wrap up this episode. We'll talk about, now that I've laid that groundwork, is it possible that Bijan could get 2,000 all-purpose yards? Is it possible that Tyler Allgeier has that dog in him and is going to outproduce Bijan? We'll get into that to answer a couple of the listener questions to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, our first question comes from Bijan Bandwag Leader in the Discord. He says, I doubt we'll see Bijan come close to 2,000 rushing yards as a rookie, but what do you think the odds are that he hits 2,000 all-purpose yards? Now, there is a slight difference between all-purpose yards and yards from scrimmage. All-purpose yards include return yards. Yards from scrimmage are just the running and receiving. I'm assuming that you mean yards from scrimmage. In large part I don't think we'll see Bijan as a returner, although I did say in OTAs we probably wouldn't see him do that in training camp. That was just an OTAs thing. He's still getting that work in training camp, so maybe I'm off the mark on that, but for now we'll assume yards from scrimmage. As I've said, like, I feel very comfortable, or more comfortable, projecting like 1,800 yards from scrimmage when you count the running and receiving yards, 1,200 yards rushing in terms of what we talked about earlier, potentially 600 or so yards receiving, something along that lines. Now, when you look at rookie running backs, or rookie players really, in NFL history, in terms of the most yards from scrimmage that they've had their rookie seasons, there's only been 3 guys that have broken 2,000 yards in NFL history in their rookie season. Eric Dickerson holds the record with over 2,200 yards from scrimmage back in 1983. Adrian James is about 100 yards behind him with over 2,100 from 1999. Saquon Barkley hit 2,028 in 2018. And then the next guy on the list is Zeke, who almost got 2,000 in 2016. And he finished 6 yards shy of 2,000. But the thing that's notable about those 4 players is Saquon and Zeke both touched the ball over 350 times. Dickerson had 441 touches that year. Adrian James had 431 touches that year. And again, going back to the earlier projection, I feel like 250 carries is a higher end projection for Bijan. And again, 50, 60 catches this year, I think, is probably the higher end projection for him. So I don't see him getting the type of touches that those guys got. You'll probably see him kind of top out around 300, maybe 310. You look at the guy that had that amount of touches in the most yards from scrimmage in NFL history. That was Clinton Portis, 306 touches in his rookie season in 2002. Again, we're only looking at rookies, not veterans, right? And he had 1,872 yards. So like that to me is kind of like the ceiling for Bijan as a rookie in terms of where I think you'll probably likely see him. Now, the most a rookie has had with less than 300 touches in his rookie season was Jordan Howard's 1,611 with 281 touches in 2016. Adrian Peterson, by the way, had 1,600 yards from scrimmage as a rookie. Alvin Kamara had 1,500. CJ2K had 1,488. Jonathan Taylor had 1,468. All those guys had less than 300 touches as rookies, by the way, as well. So, like, the 2,000 stuff, I think is, again, I won't say it's impossible, but like you're probably talking about a scenario where, like, I don't know, Tyler Allgeier missed half the season with an injury or something like that. To me, to feel like you can project that with Bijan, in order for him to get the workload that we're talking about, to get that number, or he's just really, really efficient and really explosive with the limited carries that he does get, where, like, I don't know, he's like averaging like 12 yards of reception and like 6 yards a run or something. I don't know if the math checks out that way, but that to me is what you'd have to be like historically good on like 300 touches to get to 2,000 yards. So I don't see that happening, but I think, again, I don't think people should be just assuming that Bijan's going to put up these historic numbers as a rookie. Like, I think, and again, this is part of the reason why I've been pushing back against this from a fantasy standpoint, because I think there's going to be this narrative, because there's been so much hype about Bijan coming into the league and setting all these records and leading the NFL in rushing and getting 2,000 yards from scrimmage. And it's like, if he only gets like 1,500 yards from scrimmage, like, some people will spin that as a disappointment, and, oh, I can't believe the Falcons used the top 10 pick on this bust of a, like, to fit their sort of weird agendas. And it's like 1,500 yards would be an incredible rookie season for Bijan Robinson. But because of the hype that has been built for him, some people would use that as part of, some narrative that he was a disappointment as a rookie. And, like, I don't think that's fair. So, like, my thing, part of this conversation that we've been having on the podcast the last couple of weeks is just like, let's pump the brakes a little bit. Like, again, we can project Bijan to have a really good rookie season, 1,500, 1,600, maybe even 1,800 yards from scrimmage. But, like, let's not go to the point where we're like, he's going to break all the records in the record book, and average like 5.8 yards per carry and get over 20, that sort of thing. So I feel like we need to kind of rein it in a little bit, but we'll see. Now, one person that does feel like we're going to rein it in is another person from the Discord. That is Seald6. He says, while I'm not against the possible Corey Davis acquisition, what would you say if I ran up to you out of breath tomorrow and said, Aaron, I'm an everydayer from the future, and you forgot Tyler Allgeier has that absolute dog in him, and he finishes the season with 1,429 rushing yards, 11 touchdowns, and Super Bowl MVP. Now, for those of you relatively new to the podcast, this is often the way I present scenarios where, someone claims to be from the future running up to me out of breath. And then based off of the plausibility of what their claim is to what happens in the future determines whether or not I call the cops and say there's a crazy person out here, harassing people that saying they're from the future. So we'll circle back to this Super Bowl MVP thing in a second. Now, the 1,400 yards rushing, as I outlined earlier, it's not out of the realm of possibility that a running back in Atlanta gets somewhere around 1,400 yards, right? Now, I would not predict Allgeier to be the guy to do that. I think Bijan is probably a better bet because of that explosiveness that we're talking about to be that guy. But, there's certainly circumstances that could occur where Allgeier does get, a significant chunk of carries. Bijan Robinson may miss time, and you could see Allgeier, getting a large chunk of the carries in that situation. And maybe he does hit that 1,400 yard mark or something like that. 11 tutties, as they say, isn't as crazy to me, right? Like, I mean, basically, if you're projecting a guy to get 1,400 yards rushing, like, you should be projecting him to get double-digit touchdowns. That's usually the norm in the NFL. But certainly, even in a world where he doesn't get that type of number, it's not crazy for me to think that a Falcons rusher will get double-digit touchdowns this year, because when you look at the Arthur Smith-led Titans offense, when they were one of the league's most efficient red zone offenses, they were regularly scoring 20 to 25 touchdowns each of those years. Now, obviously, the bulk of those were going to one running back in Derrick Henry during those seasons, but you could see that split. And so there's one path where, one of these guys, gets 11 touchdowns and the other one gets like 8 touchdowns or something like that. And you have a similar thing. And again, while I wouldn't predict the Falcons to be the best red zone team in the league, I wouldn't think it's not crazy to me, because they've been consistently one of the better teams in the league, right? They were pretty good in the red zone last year outside of like the first 2 or 3 games. So they were like a top 10 red zone offense. So it's like just be slightly better and you could be, top 3 red zone offense or something like that. So that's why I sit here and I go like, it's not crazy to me that they could get like be so efficient in the red zone that it could be this team that gets like 20, 25 rushing touchdowns or something like that. Now the Super Bowl MVP is probably the wildest claim and will get me to call you the cops on you. Because that scenario is like, did we trade Tyler Allgeier midseason to the Eagles or the Bills or the Bengals or something like that? Because that to me is the scenario where he's going to win the Super Bowl MVP. Because as optimistic as I am, projecting anything more than like a second round playoff exit for the Falcons this year is a tad bit crazy to me. Not because I don't think there's a scenario where they could make a deeper run in the postseason, but there's too many unknowns at this point in time for me to feel like I can say that with any sort of plausibility, any credibility or anything like that, right? Like the only thing we really know about this team is the expectation that they should have one of the better run games in the league. That's it. Everything else about this team is pretty much up in the air. And while, again, as you've heard me discuss over the last 6 months, I'm optimistic that certain things will come true. I don't really know them. And so like to basically predict the team to make that type of run in the postseason, like you need to feel really good about something other than their running game, right? You need to feel really good about their passing attack, being one of the more explosive offenses in the league, having one of the better defenses in the league. And like without knowing those things, again, we can predict and guess and be optimistic about those things, but without knowing those things, it's hard for me to even consider the conversation, right? Because I got another question from Greg E. He sent an email asking me sort of what team, assuming the Falcons make the playoffs, what team is going to be the biggest challenge for us in the playoffs? And I'm like, I don't know that because I don't really know what the strengths and weaknesses of this team are going to be, right? It's hard to say who their toughest match. Like I could pick Philadelphia just because they're the best all-around team in the NFC. And so they'll give every team a tough matchup, but I can't really project them against the 49ers or anything like that because I don't know how good this offensive line is going to be and whether I'm going to feel good about their ability to hold up against the 49ers pass rush, right? Seattle has a great trio of wide receivers, right? I don't know if this secondary is going to be able to good matchup against those guys, right? I don't know if this defensive line, let's assume another playoff team is the Lions, right? Their strength of their team is their offensive line. I don't know if this defensive line is going to be good enough to really give the Lions offensive line a run for their money, just to name a few teams. So like, that's part of it. It's like for me, it's like, let's establish a floor before we start talking about this team ceiling, right? I get it. It's hype season, all that stuff. We're being more positive, more optimistic on the podcast nowadays, but and I know Seattle 6, you're probably being a little cheeky, as the Brits say, with your question about and comment about Tyler Allgeier. But like for me at this point in time, like anybody who's asking me a question about things that will happen in January for the Falcons, like let's wait till January and we'll cross that bridge if and when we get to it, right? I'm much more worried about what's going to happen in August and September at this point in time than I am about what's going to happen in January. Like, show me that you're a good team. Like, like there's a world where the Falcons start the season 4-0. There's this world where the Falcons start the season 0-4. And the types of conversations we're having come October are going to be very different based off of that. And there's a lot of room in between those two areas. You know what I'm saying? So it's just like, okay, let's I'm not going to be too worried about that. So I would probably call the cops on you, Seattle 6, once you threw the Super Bowl MVP thing. The 1,400 yards and 11 touchdowns, I'd be like, okay, like maybe. And then the Super Bowl MVP thing, it's like, okay, like what? Like, someone, dial 911 on this dude. He's a crazy person. So that's my answer to that. Although, Jason Brownlee's heating up in Jets camp. So, the Corey Davis stuff, we'll circle back to that in like 2-3 weeks, right? When we get closer to like final cuts and whatnot. So we'll see what the Jet situation is like at that point in time. But that is going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons, guys. Check us out tomorrow with John Macri of PFF for your first listen. For your second listen today, check out the Locked On Braves podcast. It is trade deadline. The Braves are making moves. So get the scoop on, what ways the Braves can continue to keep their hold on the National League with the moves that they made by checking out Locked On Braves, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. Check out Locked On NFL as well. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.